Listen, just one more thing.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of Columbo Season 9, Episode 4, Rest in Peace, Mrs. Columbo. First broadcast on the 31st of March 1990 on ABC. It was directed by veteran TV and film director Vincent McEvity, whose film credits include several Disney movies, including a couple of the Herbie sequels. It was written by Peter S. Fisher, who previously wrote on the original Columbo series. The episode begins at a funeral, and based on the title and Columbo's presence at the funeral, this is concerning. The camera then focuses on a woman behind Columbo, and we hear her internal monologue. This is Vivian Dimitri, played by Helen Shaver.
Why don't you cry? Damn it. I cried. Oh yes, Lieutenant, I could give you lessons on that. Don't you understand? Hasn't it hit you yet? Your precious wife is gone for good, dead.
And she seems to suggest she killed Mrs. Columbo, and Columbo is next, as it transitions to a flashback to set up yet another murder she committed. I don't mind this unusual opening, or the choice to introduce an internal monologue and flashbacks to tell this story in a non-linear fashion, but I do think it could have been done in a better way. It fits only because it gives us a shocking hook to continue watching, and I don't think that's a good enough excuse to do it this way, particularly with the episode title already giving everything away. Had they just had the funeral, making it clear whose funeral it was, and then focused on Dimitri without the voiceover, it would have been much more effective for me. In the flashback, we see Dimitri showing a house to a prospective buyer. She's a real estate agent, convincing them to buy it, and then calling her boss, Charlton Chambers, the man she said she killed. When she gets home, she has a message from her old therapist, Dr. Stedman, who is worried about her mental state and wants her to seek out a new therapist. She then calls Leyland St. John, played by Ian McShane, another client who she's also having an affair with, and she arranges to meet him that night. She then loads a gun and calls the police to find out when Columbo is working, before going to see Charlton, or Charlie. She reveals it was Charlie who got her out of the sanatorium, and that her husband had died in prison after being convicted on manslaughter. He killed a client who was going to expose him for embezzlement, and she thinks Charlie helped the police catch him.
Because you're the one who made the phone call.
Who told you that?
She's there to get revenge, and so she shoots him after revealing she's going after Columbo next, the policeman who put her husband away. There is a problem with this scene, and it comes from the way the episode is set up. The exposition is very clunky, with Dimitri telling Charlie things he already knows, repeatedly, for the benefit of us, the audience. I'm not sure how you get around this because the setup is so complicated. If the setup also seems familiar, it's because Dimitri is describing a similar set of circumstances to those in the Bye Bye Sky High IQ murder, and had they been able to bring back Samantha Egger as the wife of the murderer in that, and Howard McGillen as the colleague, both who were still working at the time, they could have leaned into that much harder and maybe even used clips from that episode to tell us this part of the story in flashback. Failing that, had she pulled the gun sooner and explained exactly why she was going to kill him, rather than repeat information he would already know before pulling out the gun, it would have felt more natural. I can only assume that they may not have had the rights to the old episodes, as this was shown on a different network, but it feels like a missed opportunity to do something really interesting. Dimitri sets the scene to her liking to ensure Columbo is the one to investigate, and leaves to meet Leland for dinner. She excuses herself and goes to a cash machine, taking out money from Charlie's account and putting it in his wallet with a receipt to make the time of death look later than it was. She returns to her dinner and goes to a motel with Leland, leaving a few hours later, returning to the scene of the crime to return Charlie's wallet and take some files. She disposes of the gun and burns the files. We then return to the funeral and get the internal monologue of a different character before getting her version of a flashback. She's Dee Dee Perkins, Charlie's secretary and discoverer of the body, which is where the flashback takes us next. Columbo is there investigating and finds an envelope marked with the address of the Alden Hotel before Dimitri arrives pretending to be shocked. She tells Columbo she saw Charlie on the night of the murder, giving him an exact time. Columbo questions her, and as she's using her affair as an alibi, she pretends she went home alone. Columbo mentions it's unusual the secretary found the body, as she told him that Dimitri is usually the first one in the office. Normally this would suggest he has an idea and is fishing for confirmation, but I think the fact that this is all in flashback and we have some idea of where the story is going and are desperate to get there robs this part of the episode of any real drama. It feels like a distraction from the mystery of what has happened to Mrs. Columbo that is too much to overcome. Columbo goes to the Alden Hotel and finds an illegal bookie who clearly knew Charlie. He then goes to see Dimitri and questions her about her alibi, as he's found a few holes in it, which he was obviously meant to. She eventually breaks down and confesses where she really was and gives up the name of the man she's having an affair with, which she was always planning to do. We return to the funeral and it occurs to me that this framing device falls apart a little if you consider we were supposed to be seeing the last section from the secretary's memory of it, but she wasn't present for the majority of the scenes we saw. We now get Leland's internal monologue, and he manages to reveal Columbo has invited all of these relative strangers to the funeral. Our first indication that he might be actually up to something.
I wonder why he asked me to come. Maybe it was Vivian's idea. The Lord knows why.
Leland's flashback continues the story as Columbo questions him about Dimitri's alibi. Leland confirms it and says she was never on her own for longer than a few minutes, which obviously allows him to connect the dots from the restaurant to the cash machine. At lunch, Sergeant Brady tells Columbo they found the murder weapon near houses that Charlie had sold, but Columbo says that has nothing to do with the murder. The envelope he found contained a large sum of cash from a bet that Charlie had won, so it makes no sense that he would then go to a cash point. He now knows Dimitri did it, but has no proof. He also reveals he knows Dimitri was asking for him to be on the case, and when we return to the funeral and Dimitri's voiceover, she reveals she implicated herself on purpose, and we return to her version of the story. Columbo is at Charlie's office, which Dimitri is now running, and hints that he thinks it's someone in one of the houses Charlie sold, where the gun was found. Columbo also reveals to her he knows who her husband is and that she was receiving psychiatric care. Despite all this, Dimitri wants to meet his wife, and Columbo plays dumb and agrees. He then interviews one of the residents from the housing complex, Connolly.
Am I under arrest or what?
No, sir. Would you like to sit down, Mr. Conley? I just want to ask you a few questions.
You could have asked me the questions of my house without dragging me down here with the neighbors looking on.
That was necessary.
Who didn't see anything on the night in question, but the purpose of bringing him in was to make a very public display of it. He's baiting a trap for Dimitri. We then spend some time with Dimitri as she reminisces about her husband and gets very emotional before getting a message from Leland, which she answers. He's angry she told the cops about them, and somehow his wife has found out. Honestly, I could have done without this scene, as it's been pretty clearly established that she's unhinged and obsessed with her husband as she's working her way to becoming a serial killer. The next morning, Columbo shows up to further bait the trap, and Dimitri offers him some breakfast. He reveals his wife would love to try the marmalade she is having, and she tries again to meet Mrs. Columbo. He leaves and she gets an idea to use the marmalade to her advantage. Columbo visits the housing development and he talks through his theory with his sergeant, but still lacks proof.
She drives up the street, she opens the window, she heaves out the gun. She doesn't even have to get out of the car. She's here 30 seconds, maybe a minute tops, and she's gone without a trace.
Dimitri arrives and Columbo quickly gets his sergeant to play along as he pretends to chew him out.
I brought you this, Lieutenant. Well, actually, it's for your wife. I picked it up on the way over.
Oh, that's very nice. You didn't have to do that.
Don't be silly, it's nothing.
Columbo then goes to meet Dr. Stedman, Dimitri's former therapist, who can't talk directly about Dimitri, but Columbo is able to get around this by speaking in hypotheticals based on what he knows of Dimitri. The next day, Columbo goes to see Dimitri and informs her they are planning on arresting Connolly. His sergeant arrives to inform him Mrs. Columbo has been rushed to the hospital, and we return to the funeral. We're essentially caught up now as Dimitri consoles Columbo and he asks her to come back to his house to talk, and she agrees. He makes himself breakfast and Dimitri sees a picture of Mrs. Columbo. We finally get to see what she looks like. Columbo makes Dimitri a coffee and puts the marmalade that she gave him on the table. He goes to eat some and she briefly has a second thought about letting him eat the poisoned marmalade. But this quickly passes. He starts acting unwell and she starts talking, only to be interrupted by a phone call informing him that Mrs. Columbo was also poisoned. She continues talking, slowly revealing it was all her doing, as he gets sicker. Just as she finishes confessing and telling him he's going to die, he reveals that they aren't in his house, his wife is still alive, his sergeant was there to record the whole thing, and it's not even a photo of his wife in the house, it's his sister-in-law.
I would have done this at my house, but my wife's got a bad case of the flu. I didn't want to disturb her.
Your wife is alive?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
There is a great story in here somewhere, but it's weighed down with so many issues that it struggles to get out. I love the idea of one of his past cases coming back to haunt him in a revenge story that plays on exactly how he operates and what he reveals about himself to his suspects, but the funeral framing device doesn't really make sense and robs the story of any tension as it drags its way to the mystery of what happened to Mrs. Columbo, and at a certain point we already have guessed what happens to Mrs. Columbo before it's happened, which allows us then to think ahead as to whether that actually happened or not, or whether Columbo is outmanoeuvring Dimitri. The gotcha is brilliantly conceived too, playing with some familiar elements from previous episodes, but also getting Columbo personally involved. It just doesn't work as a complete story. It's difficult enough to care about the investigation into Charlie's murder, having started off with Mrs. Columbo's funeral. But it's damn near impossible to care anything about anything else in this episode when we know that's where the story is heading. The scene where Columbo meets Dr. Stedman is entirely pointless by the time it happens, because Columbo already has a really good idea of what Dimitri is up to. And yet, if it had happened any earlier, it would have given too much away. The question is whether giving too much away in a Columbo is a bad idea. There's a little too much clumsy exposition laid on for our benefit that doesn't really need to be there. And having all the people involved in the case at Mrs. Columbo's funeral just to make sure Dimitri is there is far too convoluted. There are a few different small adjustments you could make to the story that would make it work better. But for me, there are two ways to go about it. The first is to have the same basic structure we are used to, but not reveal that Columbo is her second target until the gotcha, allowing us to believe that Columbo has been taken in by Dimitri and that it isn't a Columbo trap. We find out that he knows exactly what's going on far too early in this episode for there to be any suspense around the marmalade or Mrs. Columbo's apparent death. And I think changing it this way would solve that. The second would be to play it like a straight mystery rather than an inverted mystery, so we don't know Dimitri killed Charlie and is targeting Columbo too. I think either would have created more tension. As it is, this is a bit of a damp squib. For me, this is a 1 out of 5 episode with a 5 out of 5 concept. So, to be fair, I feel a score of 2 out of 5 is probably the best I can give this one. Thank you. Goodbye.